welcome, Boyrun, bienvenidos a todos. Good evening to those of you joining us on the East Coast. Good afternoon, late evening to the West Coast, and hello to around the world, wherever you're coming in from. We're so glad to have you for the third and final part of our wonderful three-part series, The Jews of Monastir, with our dear friend Mark Cohen. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ethan Marcus. I'm the Director of Communications for the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America, who's so excited to be organizing this through our Sephardic Digital Academy. I just want to take a few moments and thank the Sephardic Temple of Cedarhurst for helping and being a partner in this wonderful program, particularly to Rabbi Stephen Goldman, who we love and who we greatly appreciate all his help in making this event possible. I just want to remind you all, the Sephardic Digital Academy is a wonderful new center for learning and education. All our programs are completely free and open to the public. If you're interested in learning more about our Sephardic cooking, our Sephardic Torah and Halakha courses, our Ladino language courses, and so many more courses in culture and history, and so just wonderful things, please check out our website at sephardicbrotherhood.com/Sephardic Digital Academy. One last note I'll make. If you enjoy this program, if you enjoy these lectures, please get involved. It's so important that we not only just learn about our history, we not only learn about our heritage, that we embody it today in the 21st century. This is part of the mission of the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood, to really reach out to our communities across the United States and around the globe to make sure my generation, the next generation, your kids, your grandkids, your great-grandkids, God willing, are involved and excited about this Sephardic Judaism. So please consider getting involved, join the Brotherhood, get involved with your local Sephardic synagogue like the Sephardic Temple, and maybe support us as well. We are a nonprofit initiative. Any help we can give is always appreciated. Now, without further ado, the man of the hour here, one of the leading scholars of the Jews of Monastir and the Jewish history of the Monastir, our dear friend Mark Cohen, will begin his final part of the program. Mark, whenever you're ready, please unmute and we can begin. Sorry, just unmute again. There you go.
Hello, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us. Joining me, I should say. This is the third and final lecture about the Sephardic Jews of Monastir. It's taken in the history of the last century of the community. We started in 1839, and today we're going to be going to 1939. I'm going to be covering very eventful years from 1903 to the onset of World War II. I won't be going into World War II in depth on the Holocaust, because I feel that most of that is familiar to a lot of people. But if there's a few minutes left over, of course, I'd be more than happy to answer questions, and not to make this too much of a plug, but anything that you haven't heard from me and want to know about is in my book about the Jews of Monastir. Anyway, as we discussed last week, there was an enormous resurgence of life and activity in the Jewish community of Monastir, starting in about 1880 with the beginnings of schools that were built on the Alliance model and the Alliance Israelite Universelle, and the arrival of the railroad linking the city with Salonika in 1894. Business improved, education improved. There was, by and large, peace in Monastir and the surrounding region. But as unfortunately happened in 1863, when a tremendous fire destroyed the Jewish quarter and damaged so much of the city, beginning in 1903, and then for the next 25 years, or especially through 1918, the end of World War I, Monastir was once again visited by a plague of events, including an armed revolt against Ottoman rule, a coup that toppled the Ottoman Sultan's government, years of deadly guerrilla warfare and terrorism and bombing, massive immigration to the United States and other countries, a cholera epidemic in 1911, the Balkan War of 1912, which many Americans, including myself, before I began this project, know nothing about. And then, of course, World War I, which greatly, greatly damaged the city of Monastir. And these 15 years, 1903 to 1918, caused the Jewish community of the city to decrease from a height of 11,000 at the turn of the 20th century to fewer than 4,000 after World War I. Thousands of Jews left for the United States, main settlement in New York, Rochester, New York City, Rochester, and also Indianapolis. Hundreds went to Salonika. A few hundred went to Temuco, Chile, and others went to Jerusalem. So to begin with this unfortunate period, but astonishing period full of drama, we'll start with the 1903 Macedonian revolt against the Ottoman Empire. Now, what had happened is that other mini-states had been forming as the Ottoman Empire's hold in the Balkans fell apart. Serbia came into existence. Bulgaria came into existence. Little tiny Montenegro came into existence. But the area around Monastir, and Ethan, if we can show that map again from last week, it might help people again, was still part of the Ottoman Empire. And this region was filled with people that identified as Greek or Bulgarian or Albanian, even an offshoot of people who thought of themselves as Romanian. But there were also people who started to think of themselves as Macedonian. And on August 2nd, 1903, there was an organized Macedonian revolt against Turkish rule in the area of Monastir, especially in the countryside. 25,000 armed Macedonian revolutionaries attacked the city of Monastir, where there was an army headquarters of the Turks. And on August 6th, a British telegram from Monastir back to London reported that, quote, "At the present moment, the plain of Monastir is blazing at 6 different points. A government proclamation that was slapped up on the walls and the streets of Monastir warned that the rebels would be, quote, punished and destroyed in the severest fashion." The fighting left food production disrupted, and 50,000 people became homeless. In Monastir itself, where there was American missionaries trying to convert people to Protestantism, they helped homeless people. And the missionary in Monastir wrote that the crowds of refugees at the door are so large that the Ottoman authorities have asked us to move to a side street where the crowds of refugees will not attract so much attention. An American visitor to Monastir in 1904 wrote, "One can hardly spend a week in such a town as Monastir without noting on some peaceful afternoon that the streets are strangely silent and the shutters of the shops are closed. It is simply that most ordinary of phenomena in Turkey, a panic. Some rumor has run around the bazaar of impending trouble, and every house has closed its doors." For the Jews, they were affected by this, even though they weren't direct combatants and they weren't an object of Turkish repression. However, on November 6th, a couple of weeks after the fighting ended, Abraham Mizrahi of the Alliance Committee in Monastir wrote to Paris that, quote, "We don't have to explain the lengths to which we have gone to support our schools, especially in such a period of misery as that into which the whole of Macedonia has fallen during the latest troubles." It's interesting that the Jews were never attracted to any of the national movements that took place in Monastir. It was impossible for the Jews to think of themselves as Bulgarians without belonging to the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, or the Greeks without belonging to the Greek Orthodox Church, and the same for the Serbians, and etc. But the Macedonian movement was so fuzzy, it was so ill-defined, excuse me, that at least a few Jews joined the Macedonian revolt. A man named Raphael Kamai in Monastir gave himself of the warrior name of Skender Beg, or Alexander the Great, after the great ancient Macedonian warrior. And other Jewish Macedonian activists included another Kamai, Mentesh Kamai, and two brothers, Avram and Mushon Nisan, who ferried weapons to the freedom fighters, and a man named Santo Arawesti, who raised money for the cause, and a relative, Perez Arawesti, who helped the wounded Macedonians. In the aftermath of this uprising, there was continued violence in the area for years. And the Ottoman government was so ill-equipped to run society properly that there came a Turkish uprising against the Ottoman government. These were the Young Turks, a very famous phrase. The Young Turk movement in 1908, in 1908, on July 4th, organized a revolt against the Ottoman government in Monastir. Monastir had a very famous army headquarters where, in fact, Kemal Ataturk, the future ruler of modern Turkey, had gone to military school. It began with a general who set out to crush an uprising at the military school. He was met at the telegraph office, shot 3 times and murdered, assassinated, killed by one of his own officers. By July 20th of 1908, there was a giant uprising in the town, and the Sultan stepped down, and the new Young Turk movement replaced the Sultan with the Sultan's younger brother. A photograph of a Young Turk celebration in Monastir shows that there's a banner held up by some of the celebrants that's written in Hebrew characters. This was supposed to be a renewal of the Ottoman Empire under a new basis of legal equality for everyone. Not special privileges for Muslims, but Christians and Jews also to have legal equality. However, legal equality meant duties as well as rights. It used to be that the Jews and Christians paid a special tax to avoid serving in the Ottoman military. In 1909, when the Young Turks took over the government in Istanbul, they eliminated this special exemption and required all minorities to serve in the Ottoman army. This was something the Jews and many Christians were unwilling to do. For centuries of existence in the Ottoman Empire, identity had been based on religious affiliation. And none of the minorities could believe that the Ottoman Empire would turn overnight into something resembling a democratic republic like that in France or the US that would treat or try to treat all of its citizens equally. And this was another driver of Jews leaving Monastir and coming to the United States. And let's see that first photograph, Ethan, of the passport. This is a wonderful document that I was able to find while I was researching my book, provided to me by a man from Rochester, New York, Bahor Meir. This was his Ottoman passport to leave Monastir on September 17th, 1906, written in Arabic alphabet of Turkish, and then in French. He is a subject of the Ottoman Empire, Bahor Meir. He was born in Monastir. Over here on the bottom on the left, you can see the word religion. It says Israelite. He's 25 years old, and he's leaving the empire. The destinations for the Monastir Jews. Let's go to the next photograph, please. Okay, well, some of my timeline is a little off, but the emigration resulted, of course, in one of the largest communities of Monastiris in New York City. And as you can see, they organized themselves into a corporate structure in order to raise money as a nonprofit in August 1912. And in the next slide, please. I should have put them up. Go one more, please, Ethan. The Young Friends Club of Monastir in 1917 organized a theatrical event to raise money for the Jews of Monastir back in Monastir. There was tremendous cooperation between the Jews who had remained in Monastir and those who had left. And that was extremely important because during these years, life in Monastir became more and more difficult. Between the Young Turk Revolution in 1908 and the start of the Balkan War in 1912, the number of people, the number of Jews leaving the city made it harder and harder for the rest of the Jews in the city to run any of the institutions that supported the community, especially the schools. And we see a letter of 1908 that the schools were breaking down. The Jewish parents in Monastir became less and less happy with the schools and the directors that the schools, that the Alliance sent. In 1908, they wrote the Alliance, "We categorically refuse to send our children to the boys' school under the direction of Mr. Ari. We hope you won't oblige us to send our sons to the foreign schools." Those were the schools run by the Christian missionary schools. But no matter what the Alliance tried to do to help the community structure its schools and support them during this time of immigration, the larger political situation was just impossible. By 1911, the Greeks and the Bulgarians, who were the main actors trying to decide the future of Macedonia, had resorted to what historians consider the beginning of modern terrorism. For instance, on January 30th, 1912, a bomb exploded outside of the Bank de Salonique in Monastir. More explosions followed, and by the autumn of that year, 1912, the violence was so chronic that on September 26th, the American missionary in the city, a woman named Mary Matthews, wrote home to reassure her relatives, quote, "Don't worry about the bombs here." Unlikely to make anybody feel secure, a letter like that. In 1911, while all this was happening, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire came to visit Monastir, and the Jews created a large greeting party for the Sultan. But the situation was untenable. And the Jews in the city made their plight known to the Alliance in Paris after being asked to help raise money for the Jews of Fez in Morocco. And they wrote to the Alliance this in July 1912. We are now going through a very serious crisis. The troubled situation in our region has completely halted business, and we view the future with great uneasiness. This explains the delay we had in collecting this aid. We pray that you will express to our unhappy brothers in Fez our sorrowful sympathy. What was actually kind of extraordinary is that given the troubles in Monastir, the Jews were still able to raise 600 French francs, the equivalent of 600 French francs, for the troubled Jews in Fez, Morocco. I found that very, very touching. On October 17th, war finally came. The states of Bulgaria, Serbia, Montenegro, and I'm sorry, and Greece, excuse me. Those four states all declared war on the Ottoman Empire to retake the lands that were still held by the Ottoman Empire in Macedonia. What this meant was evacuation of the city. David Russo recalled that the elders of our community advised all the families to send their young to America because the conditions were not stable. There was a confiscation of property. The Serbs, who had taken control of the city shortly after the war began, brought in tens of thousands of soldiers, confiscated homes to put their soldiers up, took people's food and money, and during the course of the Balkan Wars, about 2,500 Jews left the city. Those wars, the Balkan Wars were brief, 1912 to 1913. Unfortunately, right after those wars came World War I. Monastir, as part of Serbia, you'll remember that Serbia, a Serbian nationalist, started the war with the assassination of the Archduke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. War was declared on Serbia almost immediately. Just to give you a foreshadowing of what the city will go through, at the end of the war, this is what one of the members of the Jewish community wrote. How beautiful was the city of Monastir, with its white houses displayed along the banks of the cool and clear river, and with its markets teeming with diverse crowds of a half a dozen nations. What a magnificent panorama formed by the mountains' snowy summits and green forests. But what she was due to suffer, the city that, after Salonika, seemed destined to play a major role in Monastir. By 1915, the war in Serbia had created a situation of starvation for the Jews of Monastir. And on March 16, 1915, the French consul of the French government, who participated with the Jewish community in the town, wrote on behalf of the Jews of Monastir to the Alliance in Paris this terrible letter. Mr. Ben Simon has made an urgent appeal to Salonika, generous Salonika, to which I'm certain the town will not fail to respond. But I repeat, the situation is desperate, much more desperate than anyone can imagine. And whoever takes upon himself the task of saving these beings, who were otherwise condemned to die of hunger must be able to count on several other volunteers to help. The Alliance will not want to miss the opportunity of participating in this charitable work that requires the highest priority. Word of this problem reached New York no later than April 1915, when 150 Monasteries attended an Ahavat Shalom de Monastir meeting at 135 Eldridge Street to discuss the suffering of the Monastir Jews and raise money. Additional fundraising was held by the Chevre Anshe Sepharad Shel Monastir of Indianapolis. And it was also reported in the general Sephardic press in November and December that year. The starvation in Monastir was widespread, and the American Red Cross sent doctors as part of its mission. They wrote this in September 1915. The children live upon bread alone, and many of them go all day long without any food, save that which they are able to beg. Infants are starving for lack of nourishment. The poor, emaciated mother is unable to provide either the milk from her breasts or money to purchase cow's milk. It's horrible. It's an unknown chapter, I think, for many of us, which has been understandably overshadowed by the much worse Holocaust. But the terrible period during World War I was really terrific. And it's groups like this, Young Friends of Monastir, that raised money to help the problem, to alleviate the problem. It came again in 1916. The problem continued, and the city was now under Bulgarian rule. The city had been conquered. It was an enormously complex time. And this is a fascinating little story of how the Jews in New York, the Monasteries in New York, found a way to get money to the Jews of Monastir who were now part of Bulgaria. In January 1916, 2 months after the city fell to Bulgaria, money raised by the Monasteries in New York was first funneled to Monastir through the chief rabbi of Bulgaria in Sofia. This was done with the help of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, known as the Joint. So they wired the money first to the Salonican Wiener Bank Association. There it was converted from United States dollars to Bulgarian lev. Then the lev were sent to Rabbi Pipano in Sofia, Bulgaria. From Sofia, Bulgaria, the chief rabbi there sent the money to Monastir. It came in March when New York sent $200, which back then was not a small amount of money. New York's monasteries were in such close contact with Monastir itself that they were in a position to recommend individuals who should administer the money. The Monastir Committee here in New York said that the money should be run by a man named Solomon Nahama, Isaac Aruti, Abram Albaldi, Solomon Arwesti, and Moshe Testa. Amazing. During these years, of course, Jewish immigration to America was cut off. So the Jews had to stay in the city and endure this. The war ended, the World War I continued, of course. And in 1917, the Bulgarians, who had taken the city from the Serbians, were now pushed out of the city by the British and the Serbians. And the Bulgarians and their German allies had to retreat from Monastir, but only to the hills surrounding the city. And from the hills surrounding the city, the German and Bulgarian forces bombed Monastir nearly every day for 22 months. I remember once my nonna talking about this, how they ran through the streets with mattresses on their back to protect themselves. What happened during these 22 months was that the city's Jewish community lost nearly all of its schools and synagogues, much of its property, wealth, population, and history. Both Alliance schools, the one for boys and girls, were destroyed, as was the Kahal Kadosh Portugal Synagogue and all the food stores and money that had been gathered. There are particular days when terrible, terrible things happen. One of the worst is that photo of bombing that we saw before. Ethan, maybe we can go back to that. No, back. There we go. This is a photo from August 1917, when the city was bombed. Here. Poison gas shells and incendiary bombs fell in Monastir. More than 550 people were killed. A British doctor in Monastir wrote, "I have several terrible photographs of rows of little children and their mothers lying dead among the ruins of their houses, having been asphyxiated by these gas shells." Volunteers from America, from the Red Cross, reported this in the spring of 1917. I'm sorry. "We have over 1,000 refugees, several hundred of them Jews. We have 3 tents for Jews, 2 for Christians, and a few for several hundred Turks." On August 4th, 1917, Monastir suffered one of the worst shell attacks of the war, and for 6 hours, incendiary and gas shells fell on the city and set it afire. 1,200 bombs set a fire that burned half the city. And this was probably when 5 of Monastir's 10 synagogues, including the Kahal Kadosh Portugal, the Cal de Portugueses, the Cal de Abacho, and the Cal Aragon, and the Talmud Torah school was destroyed. Again, in December 1917, December 31st, 13,415 shells hit the city, killing 500 people and wounding more than 700. After the war, there were only 3,200 Monastir Jews left in the city. Of that number, nearly 8,000 had gone. Of that number, 1,000 were, quote, on the government list of the entirely destitute, who were entitled to receive free rations from the Red Cross and from the Serbian government. Serbia retook the city at the end of the war, and following World War I, Serbia became united into a larger country of Yugoslavia. Another observer wrote, when the bombing finally ended on September 14th, 1918, after 22 months, someone in the town wrote, "We are happy today in being free from shells, fire, and gas." And another wrote, The monastery residents who had, quote, lived in cellars for 2 years were now joyfully thronging in the streets and living again in the remains of their houses. Let's go to the next list. Next photograph, please. Another one, please. This is an extraordinary document. This is a list. It's amazing that it still exists. In 1920, the monasteries of New York City, in response to the crisis caused by World War I, sent 32 cases, not little boxes, but large cases shipped by sea on boats of clothing to Monastir's Jews. The monasteries in New York wanted to make sure that everything was run properly. So they demanded a list of the name of every Jew in the city who received clothing. And this is page 1 of the list. It says names and prenames. It's the number on the list, the person's age, their street, and I could be wrong, but I think this is my great-grandmother, listed here living on Davidova Street, and the number of souls in her household being 5, herself and 4 children, which would have been my Nonna, Becky, her younger sisters Clara and Esther, and her brother Aaron. The name is Sarah, which was my great-grandmother's name. My Aunt Shirley was named for her. Bechor, which was the name of her husband. As I may have mentioned, I know I mentioned, but I don't know who was here, the Sephardic naming custom was that a married woman took the first name of her husband as her middle name. So the letters that were sent to my Nonna from her siblings in Monastir, which I have today, thanks to my Aunt Shirley, who kept them after my Nonna's death, say, Dear Becky Max Cohen. So the first name of the husband was used as the woman's middle name. So this is Sarah Bechor Kamai. And this says Bivda, Spanish for widow. And so this enormous list was made of all the Jews in the town who received clothing. Really an amazing display of generosity on the part of the Monastir Jews in America. At the end of the war in 1919, the Monasteries wrote the Alliance, and they wrote this. Jacques Israel wrote on January 17th, 1919, "It would really be impossible to describe to you, Mr. President, the great calamities which have befallen our wretched community during this terrible war. Unfortunately, and at the risk of it becoming almost pathetically comic, this was not the end. On April 18th, 1922, at 9 o'clock in the morning, a long ignored train in the train yard that was filled with munitions, kind of similar to what happened not long ago. Where did that ignored cache of fireworks explode recently? It was in the news not long ago. In Greece, in Pakistan, somewhere very recently, there was a tremendous explosion in a port, and it was in a warehouse, and was a forgotten warehouse filled with dynamite and other things. It was recently in the news. Anyway, it's amazing how these things recur. That happened on April 18th, 1922. 3,000 people were made homeless by this blast, which set fires that burned for 9 hours. Again, the Jews of Monastir wrote to the Alliance for help, And this letter of April 18th says, Monastir, exclamation, exclamation. Heroic Monastir, double exclamation. Once so prosperous and so flourishing, is now no more than a pile of ruins. She is making a supreme effort to rise up again from the ashes, but alas, she is powerless to do so. Let's go to the next picture. What happened now, I'm running over time, I apologize. What happened next in Monastir, I'll speak just extemporaneously, which will be better anyway, is that from 1918 to 1936, when the Zionist movement that had begun with Theodor Herzl in the 1890s had become a pan-European and even worldwide movement. And in Monastir, with the destruction of virtually everything that had come before, the young Jews of the city saw no future for themselves other than gravitating toward Zionism. They now found themselves in a new country of Yugoslavia, to which a country they didn't understand and to which they had no allegiance. The city had been completely destroyed. The Alliance schools had been destroyed. The traditional Talmud Torah religious schools had been destroyed. The synagogues had been destroyed. Into this cultural and religious vacuum came the Zionist movement. And this is a membership card, Kartiz Chaver, membership card, Agudat Zionit, Zionist movement of Ha-Techiyah, which is a rebirth. And here is the Serbian and Yugoslav name of the city, Bitol. And here's the young woman. Her last name is Navon. I have the original here with the caption completed. Her name was Buena Navon. Buena Navon. Next slide, please. Next photo. This is a photo of the Jews who emigrated to Temuco, Chile. This was taken in the early 1920s. The next, please. This is a meeting during the 1920s. The Monastery Jews, again, seeking help from their brethren in America. This is Rabbi Jain, who was the chief rabbi of Monastir, who visited Indianapolis, and this was a dinner in his honor. Next one. This is the same Rabbi Jain. I'm having difficulty locating, but this was a dinner in New York for the Monastery Jews, a fundraiser on behalf of the Monastir Jews. Next one. An interesting photograph from the Young Men's Sephardic Association of Rochester, New York. This from the 1940s and early 50s. Next one. This is a photo of the Monastir Jews who had fled Monastir during World War I and the tremendous bombing for the city of Salonika, which during the Balkan Wars was conquered by Greece and renamed Thessaloniki. And the Monastiris built their own synagogue in the city. It is the only synagogue in Salonika that survived World War II. The Germans used it as a storehouse. It is the only synagogue in the city, and it's the Monastir synagogue. Next one. This is the heart of the remaining chapter of life in Monastir. And this is the Sephardic group, Techiyah. And here we see the young men and women of Techiyah, of Monastir, dressed in Western style, completely westernized by now, wearing suits and ties, modern dresses and skirts, and ready to live a new life, a completely non-traditional life. Next one, please. more photographs of the Monastir Jews who were drawn to Zionism. Another one, please. This is a very touching photograph. The Monastiris requested a Hebrew teacher from Palestine be sent to the community to teach the young Jews Hebrew. And this is Leah ben David, the teacher who was sent. And these are the children who were dressed up for, it's not clear if it was Purim or because of the flowers in their hair, perhaps Tu B'Shvat, which we had the other day, which is the celebration of the coming spring. The source is not clear, but of course, most of these children were destined for death. The next photograph, please. This is the famous Leon Kamai, who was the main Zionist leader in Monastir. And I want to read, I apologize, I feel maybe unduly guilty that there was too much to cover in this time and I flustered a little bit. I apologize to you all. But I want to read an extraordinary quote from a visitor to Monastir in 1936. He toured the city. He saw the poverty. This is what he wrote. He was going through all the Jewish communities of Yugoslavia. And when he got to Bitol, he said this: "Everything I have seen until now are utterly luxurious compared to these wooden huts. There are about a dozen of them packed together, encircling a dirty courtyard. They are nothing but dark caves wherein live, packed into a few square meters, families of 6 and 10 persons." But then he visited the Zionist clubhouse and he wrote this: "Here for the first time I recovered, as if I had awoken from a nightmare. A nightmare. In this cozy clubhouse, among these youngsters, I suddenly grasped the true meaning of chalutziut, pioneering, the value of the persistent and undying aspiration that had become imbibed by these youths to bring about a change in their lives and tie their fate to the land of Israel. I understood at last how these youngsters were being stifled in the suffocating atmosphere of their town, and that they wish and are able to live in the spirit of Israel. The youth club is the one place where one can breathe freely." And the next photograph, please. This is another group. This is another Zionist group, Hashomer Hatzair, which was a very left-wing group, the Young Guard, that was very successful in Monastir in the 30s. Please, another photograph. And this is the last photograph. This was a wonderful find. This is a Monastir Li who made Aliyah in 1934, as you can see down here. He went to Kibbutz Ha'amakim, Sha'ar Hamakim, which was a kibbutz to which a number of Hashomer Hatzair labor Zionist members went. Just a moment ago, with the help of Ethan, I was able to finally figure out this family name. It's Hazen. Hazen. The Israelis were trying to make sense of this Sephardic name. Hazen, they wrote. In parentheses, he had apparently taken a Hebrew name, Betzalel, and his first name was Jack. He used Yugoslavit, Sephardit, and I can't find the city now, but he's from Bitol. This was the last flowering of renewal of life in the city for the Jews. So during the last century, which over the past 3 weeks I've tried to give you a sense of, there were these three distinct periods: the period up until 1863, which was the last period of traditional life, where boys and girls received traditional religious schooling, or in the case of girls, no schooling at all. After 1863 to 1903, 40 years of economic improvement, the arrival of French language Jewish schools from Paris, business opportunities, and then from 1903 to the 1930s, the destruction of the town and a final renewal in Zionism. In all of Yugoslavia, the tiny group from Monastir, the tiny community of Monastir, which was about 1/10 the entire population of the country, sent more Jews to pre-state Israel than any other community in the country. What Zionism offered these people after the destruction of World War I was really tremendous and irresistible. So I feel I shouldn't, of course, neglect the Holocaust, which understandably is crucially important. I'm sure everybody knows that the town, the inhabitants of the town were rounded up and deported in March 1943 to Treblinka, where virtually everyone was murdered. It's the same horrible story that we're unfortunately accustomed to. But prior to that, I must say the community showed extraordinary resilience to keep reinventing itself, to keep finding a new way to live following one crisis and catastrophe after the other. So in our own time of hardship, which does not compare, I think, in the least for most of us with what happened to our grandparents or great-grandparents, I think maybe we can take some solace and maybe keep our mouths shut a little bit when we want to complain about what hard times really are. I'd be happy to take any questions. I see we have quite a crowd today. And I see that there's a chat box here, Ethan. Ethan, do you want to run this chat thing? Can't hear you. No, still can't hear you. Do I need to mute myself to hear you? Something's wrong. Someone said it looks to me like Aharon. Maybe it is Aharon. I can't tell if it's a Resh Vav or it's, you have to remember that was written in cursive. So I think it might be a Zion, but I always get confused because, as you probably know, the Zion and the Gimel in Sephardic, in cursive Hebrew, they're mirror images of one another. So I get them confused.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Sorry about that. That was a problem with my audio. So first of all, Mark, Hazak Baruch on a wonderful three-part series, especially this evening was particularly excellent. So thank you so much. We have a couple of questions here already. One question that kept popping up quite a bit. Do you know where we could find those records, the 1921 list of the recipients that donated the clothes to Monastir? Or is there any way we can look at that?
Yes. Now, I got the entire list for my research. And it's been 17 years since the book came out, so forgive me, but I'm pretty sure what I did with that was I gave it to the publisher of the book, which is the Foundation for the Advancement of Sephardic Studies and Culture. And they have a website, and people should write to them and ask if they would post the entire list on their website. Failing that, I can go back to my bibliography and I can request it again from the archives at the Joint in New York. They were the ones who provided it to me. They photocopied the entire list. And we'll have to ask permission whether they'll allow us to post the entire list. But it is an extraordinary list. One of the things that I love to tell is that included on the list was a guy whose nickname was El Loco, the crazy one. And also on the list was an Islamic name, a Muslim name, a guy who worked in the school, like as a custodian, which I thought was also interesting, that the Jewish community had, or maybe we forget, the Jewish community was so ensconced, so at home in this town for so long. They naturally had contacts with members of the Islamic community, the Greek community, the Bulgarian community, until, of course, everything fell apart. But but I would recommend going on the website of the publisher, and a lot of people emailing and saying, we heard about this wonderful list of the 1920 list of all the people that received clothing, and we'd love to see it. And let's see what happens after that. And I'll stay in touch with Ethan. And if more help is needed, I'll do what I can.
Another question here regarding the naming custom that women were taking their husband's name as the middle name. The question here, was that specifically a Monastir custom or a Greek custom or an Ottoman custom in general?
I can't imagine that it was Monastir specific. There's no reason for me to think that that was the case, but I don't know for sure. All I know is it absolutely was the case among the Monastir Sephardim. It could be that because Monastir was so isolated in its Macedonian mountains for so many centuries, that it might have been a very old custom that perhaps died out earlier elsewhere and was still practiced in Monastir in the 20th century, whereas maybe in Salonika, a big port city with access to the outside world much more readily, maybe it was a custom that had died out. People who have friends from other Sephardic towns and communities can ask, did you ever hear of this? Unfortunately, it's not the kind of thing you'd run into unless you have written documents and to see how people were formally addressed, like the letter I have on my wall behind me that I had translated by a professor at Stanford, and then my Nonna's sister in Israel, who was able to read the handwritten cursive Hebrew Ladino as if she had been reading it for the past 70 years. And it says, Dear Becky Maxie Cohen. So.
Another question here regarding the article, or at least the ad you mentioned and showed from 1917, asking for relief. Do you know what Sephardic newspaper that was posted in?
In my book, it appears with a caption that tells that information, and it should be here. This notice appeared in New York's La America, a Judeo-Spanish newspaper, and announces the performance of a 4-act comedy, Los Falsos Filósofos, the False Philosophers. When I was a kid, my dad still used that term, falsu, as someone who was a kidder who told fibs. A falsu. I don't know if anybody remembers that term, falsu, essa falsu.
Another question here, specifically regarding the rabbis of Monastir. What insights can you give us regarding the major rabbinic families and rabbinic leadership, such as the Kasorla family, which is a well-established one?
Right, there was the Kasorla, but from what I could find in the historical documents, I mean, I'm not sure how formal all these designations were. Now, the Rabbi Jane, and it's difficult to figure out how to spell that name in our alphabet, but the man who came to Rochester and New York to raise money. He was the official rabbi during the Yugoslav period in the 20s and was paid by the state as the official rabbi of the community. So he was as official as it gets. There's a photograph in my book of a number of other religious leaders who are gathered together with Rabbi Jane in the center. So there are other people mentioned. My book would give you all of that information. I'm looking quickly to see if I can find that photograph. Oh, it's a photograph. So it would be in the photographic insert. And it is, there's no point in you waiting around for me to find it. Oh, here it is. There's a photograph. I don't know if you can see this here. A photograph of the rabbinical and community leaders in the city. It's the Malbish Arumim Society, the Clothe the Naked Society. That's a phrase taken right from the Hebrew Bible, right from Isaiah, clothe the naked. But there's another photograph of the leading religious figures. Here it is. This is what I wanted to show. That photograph here. And at the center is an Avraham Romano, who in 1931 was considered the chief rabbi of the community.
Excellent. And I think this is also a good plug to say, go buy the book, because if you don't have it yet, this is a good time to get it. It's a really wonderful book for sure. Speaking to someone who's read it. I think with that, it looks like all the questions we have this evening, and it looks like a good time to stop. I just want to take a moment and thank Mark again so much for this wonderful 3-part presentation that he's really put together. Really, it's just a wonderful educational opportunity. You know, we say the pandemic is a really difficult time for all of us, but moments like these really give a little bit of a light for all of our communities. So we thank you so much, Mark, for this wonderful 3-part.
You're very welcome, and I hope that people feel that it was worth their time and interest. I enjoyed very much doing it, and if anyone has any questions for me, I'd be happy to answer them. So please you can just email me.
Absolutely. We'll send out his email also if you have any additional questions. And as a reminder, all the 3 classes were recorded. So you can just go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/Sephardic Brotherhood. You can see all the previous recordings, all our other classes. And don't forget, this is a nonprofit initiative. We do rely on your support. If you're ever able to give, I know it's difficult right now, but if you're ever able to give to support future classes and future programs, we'd always really appreciate it, especially as we try to highlight the history of the Jews of Monastir, a wonderful community. And frankly, many of our hubs, in New York, in Rochester, in Indianapolis, at the Chaim synagogue there, still active, still involved, and still, God willing, thriving communities for many more years to come. Lastly, I just want to thank again the Sephardic Temple of Cedarhurst and Rabbi Golden for all the help in partnering with us and making this possible. With that, I want to wish everyone a Nochada Buena, a Fruticas Alegre, happy Tu B'Shvat for those of you who celebrated today, and hope you all have a wonderful rest of the week. Al vemos.